Okay. First of all, thanks to Simon and several colleagues whom I recognize from Umio, where I encountered the last time I was there, last year ago, November, actually, this Sami drum in a local museum, which inspired me to take a bit of time to recognize and respect that we are not always living on lands that in some ways belong to us, but we are guests. And so I want to be grateful and respectful to our ancestors as well as our hosts. I also want to thank Ekaterina Pashevich, who's a PhD student of ours, excuse me, whose work on social robots for children has inspired much of what I'll say today. I've added a question since doing some work on the talk. Should you kick a robot dog? Should you torture an avatar, and other fun things? So there is a plan. I want to talk about such things as abusing non-humans, starting with robot dogs. We may well think that, so what? But this becomes interesting when we explore how human beings respond to these sorts of abuses. There's sometimes surprising responses. And then turn to research ethics, specifically within human-machine communication, which I'll give a definition of towards the end, really. This will require some attention to some primary ethical frameworks. Those of you who've heard me talk before will recognize especially the discussion of deontology and utilitarianism, as well as virtue ethics. But I want to highlight some work, or a document actually, from the Swedish Ethical Review Authority, and then turn to more specific reasons and arguments as to why you probably shouldn't kick a robot dog. I'll then move to human-machine communication research and research ethics proper. And this being Scandinavia, we will close with a quiz. So be prepared, perhaps take notes. So is it cruel to kick a robot dog? So far as I know, this wasn't really introduced by philosophers so much as it was by journalists. This is from 2015. You may recognize the robot dog from Boston Dynamics, which was developed originally for the military. If you haven't a robot dog around, you might have Siri or Alexa. Should you be swearing at Siri? A question raised by 2016. And or should we ask people to torture an avatar? I'll say more about the Milgram experiments that this is based on. And those are just sort of starter questions. Why not? Why should we worry about these non-human devices? Noel Sharkey is quoted in this first article, who is also an emeritus professor, but much more prominent and interesting. He started something called the Campaign to Stop Killer Robots, or Lethal Autonomous Weapons Systems, in 2009 or so, which is now quite prominent, but still finding resistance, surprise, among nations such as the United States and so forth. But he says, well, why not? The only way it's unethical is if the robot could feel pain. So what this raises is then a question of both the capacity of these devices to feel pain or pleasure, for that matter, or what philosophers like to talk about in terms of the moral status of non-human entities. So here's your first ethical framework: utilitarian considerations. The utilitarian mantra is to maximize pleasure, minimize pain, in the name of the greatest good for the greatest number. We'll see a little bit more about that as we go along. You probably are by no means surprised that people resist this kind of behavior in a way, but perhaps it's just anthropomorphizing. And again, Noel Sharkey says, we as humans attribute human qualities to many things. Designers have been using this for years. And it doesn't even have to look human or dog-like. This is a 1990s so era Tamagotchi. And I think there are some people actually old enough to remember these things. There's no anthropomorphization here, but there's often deep emotional attachment. In one case, a young girl committed suicide when her parents took away her Tamagotchi. So this is in some ways not to be, this is not quite so trivial as it might seem. The philosopher Mark Kuckelberg, who's now at the University of Vienna, was also quoted in this article, and said the ethical question would be the behavior itself. Are violent gestures and behaviors towards anything, even if it's not conscious, if that thing is not conscious, if it cannot feel pain, are those themselves good? And he responds to his question by saying, I would say that training violent gestures and behavior is not good for the human person and for others, specifically from a virtue ethics perspective, regardless of the moral status of the robot. So again, we'll have to talk about moral status and then indirect duties in Kant. But before we get there, a last version. Should you swear at Siri or Alexa or whomever? This is an article from the Harvard Business Review, I think also 2016, and the provenance is important. Surprisingly, perhaps, these behaviors are not sustainable. If adoptive bots learn from every meaningful human interaction they have, then mistreatment and abuse become technological toxins. Bad behavior can poison bot behavior. This undermines enterprise, efficiency, productivity, and culture. And they're not speaking theoretically. I think most of us understand or remember how long Microsoft's chatbot Tay lasted before the Twitter stream turned her into a racist asshole, to use a technical academic term. I don't think Microsoft is worried about Tay's character or ours, but they are worried about company PR and the bottom line. And this again pushes us in the direction of more utilitarian or consequentialist ethics. But it's helpful, I think, to stop for a bit and say, well, so what? And remember something about the origins of research ethics, human subject protections, and then talk about moral status of devices. I don't think many of us remember, unless you've specialized in a way in the history of research ethics, but research ethics comes out of things. It comes out of particularly the Tuskegee Institute studies and World War II medical experiments. I don't know if you are familiar with this study. It ran from 1932 to 1972, a long time. Approximately 400 African-American males who were infected with syphilis. Their syphilis was allowed to develop naturally versus some control groups in order to determine best how the disease worked and then treatment strategies. The African-American men who participated in the study were told that they were receiving free health care from the federal government of the United States, but they were not. This is generally considered one of the great atrocities in research, perhaps not at the scale of the things that were done to World War II prisoners in Germany and Japan. But out of this, over a series of decades, there emerged then the familiar research ethics protections for human subjects. These are grounded in notions of autonomy, privacy, confidentiality, and informed consent, along with freedom from unnecessary harms. These are usually couched or grounded in some notion of human rights. But human rights, if they exist, have to come from somewhere. And the sort of standard, but I think centrally important grounding for this is in both Kant and deontological ethics more broadly. The Kantian conception of the human being, which is certainly open to critique and revision, but one that I want to stay with in ways that I think will be clear. The human person is a rational autonomy, not necessarily a rugged individual, not necessarily an atomist. It could be a relational autonomy, and it can also be an affective autonomy, but certainly a rational autonomy as an entity capable of self-rule. What this means is that we insist upon viewing human beings as freedoms that are capable of determining their own aims, goals, etc. in life. If we fail to do that, quite simply, we treat them as slaves. and without giving you the entire history of liberal democratic politics over the last 200 years, it is this notion of the human being that grounds modern norms of respect, equality, including gender equality, and liberal democratic polity. Another way of getting at this is that if we regard human beings as having a moral status as rational autonomies, then they deserve or require these basic human rights. Again, duties of respect or equal treatment. In this light, Noel Sharkey is perfectly correct. Robots, AIs, avatars, Tamagotchis are not rational entities or rational autonomies, and they do not have moral status. So we don't have to worry about that. So far as we know, they will not have the capacity to feel pain. They can fake pain. But let's imagine some science fiction future in which perhaps they could feel pain. Then the question would be, from a utilitarian framework, would it be wrong to inflict pain if any harms that occurred there would outweigh the possible benefits? So for the roboticist at Boston Dynamics, the question would be, okay, there may be some kind of harm to this individual unit, but we're learning a lot about robots. These robots will save lots of lives, and we're often running into the domain of utilitarian ethics. Quite simply, utilitarian ethics is a kind of ethical cost-benefit approach. Which act will lead to the greatest benefit or the greater benefit, the greatest good for the greatest number, usually couched in terms of happiness, starting with Bentham. This would be physical happiness or pleasure. John Stuart Mill expanded this to include notions of intellectual or other forms of pleasure. But this ambiguity of pleasure is itself already a first reason as to why applying utilitarian approaches in praxis is often difficult. What is the greatest good, and how are we to measure it? We use utilitarian ethics a whole lot, especially in warfare. Soldiers are people whose pain and lives we are willing to sacrifice for the greater good. There are examples, rather tragic examples of bombings of Coventry or Hiroshima and Nagasaki, where thousands or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of human lives were sacrificed in the name of some greater good. And then the question becomes, well, what happens to individual rights, such as privacy rights or human rights more broadly, vis-a-vis business or national security? Are there some rights that, for example, the rights of the 400 African-American men in the Tuskegee Institute study, or in this example, the dissident journalist Jamal Khashoggi, who was killed at the behest of Saudi Prince Mohammed bin Salman? Can these rights always be overridden for utilitarian reasons? In the case of the Trump administration, no, I'm sorry, we're not worried about that at all. The greater good, in this case, $100 million of arms trade with the Saudis was more important. If you find that appalling or at least disturbing, other examples would include justification of slavery and genocide. Then this may mean that you will take on a different kind of ethic. But the problem with utilitarianism, to try to sum this up a bit, is that the so-called greater good can be translated into monetary success, safety, or health. This needs to be balanced against possible harm. So when you see the language of balance in a few minutes, this is what is after. But the problem for those of us who, as I hope these examples suggest, find with utilitarianism is that the more the increased and expected good, the more harm can be justified. And so again, various and sundry harms that I think are highly problematic can be justified in the name of utilitarianism. So I get nervous about it at the very least. But these are the two frameworks that operate primarily in the ethical research guidelines that have emerged so far. So this is from the Swedish Ethical Review Authority, the Ethics Review Act. Sorry. And just this is where you want to take notes for your quiz later on. And so I will do PowerPoint karaoke. And also, this is helpful to recognize the point that no one is either a pure, or very few people are probably a pure utilitarian or a pure deontologist. We're always using both together in some way or another, perhaps. But in this case, paragraph 1, the purpose of the law is to protect the individual and respect for human dignity in research. So you can hear autonomy in the background and a deontological ethic. Section 8 insists that human rights and fundamental freedoms must always be taken into account. Again, this is deontological, while taking into account the interest that new knowledge can be developed through research, and research that, or new knowledge that is likely to be beneficial. So the welfare of people should be given priority over the needs of society and science. So even so, deontology trumps, no pun intended, utilitarianism. Section 9, research may only be approved if the risks it may pose to the health, safety, and personal integrity of research subjects are outweighed by its scientific value. So this is almost shockingly utilitarian. Yes, we can sacrifice the few for the good of the many. Section 10 takes us back, or does the same thing. Research may not be approved if the expected result can be achieved in another way that involves less risks to the health, safety, and personal integrity of research subjects. Processing of sensitive personal data and data on crime may only be approved if it is necessary for the research to be carried out. But once again, utilitarianism trumps deontology, where deontology would insist on the rights of privacy and thereby data protection, including personal or sensitive data. One of the problems that emerges once we recognize these two frameworks and perhaps others is that they work differently in different countries or cultural traditions. One of the reasons, as many of you have heard me say before, I'm quite happy to be in Scandinavia, is that in this part of the world, we tend to emphasize a more deontological approach. And so this also has to do with the nature of the person as being perhaps more relational, but that's another lecture. It may be that because there's a higher deontological emphasis here, there's at least a correlation with greater equality within the society and the law. If you move to more the Anglo-American world roughly, utilitarianism or pragmatism dominates there, and perhaps it's not accidental that those societies also are marked by greater hierarchy, less equality. This has been acknowledged or understood now for a very long time. This is from Ben Carsten Stahl's work in 2004. So here we are, or at least some of us are sitting within the red ellipse of Protestant Europe, on the far end of self-expression values and on the far end of secular rational values. Deontology works well here, perhaps, but in other parts of the world, we may be faced with more traditional views that may be also more hierarchical, that may be more utilitarian, and so on. This raises a question that I can only point to here, and that is, what do we do about these cultural differences when we start researching across borders? And there are responses to that, but I'm saving those slides for Q&A if we have time for that and if there is interest. So why shouldn't you kick a robot dog? A first response, and this is in Mark Hulkenberg's most recent article from 2020, How to Use Virtue Ethics for Thinking About the Moral Standing of Robots, includes both deontology and virtue ethics. It starts with a Kantian notion of indirect duties. So, quoting the article, formulating the issue from the point of view of the human moral agent, Kant famously argued that we only have indirect duties towards dogs because of the potential implications for the character of the humans involved, and more generally for cruelty among humans. So this is to say, I loved my dog when we had dogs, but I didn't necessarily regard her as a highly rational, certainly clever, but not necessarily highly rational. A strict Kantian would say I don't have a direct duty to that dog as I would to a human being. But still, that doesn't mean I'm free to be cruel to it. So Kant gives the example of if a man has his dog shot because it can no longer earn a living for him, he is by no means in breach of any duty to the dog, since the latter is incapable of judgment, but he thereby damages the kindly and humane qualities in himself, which he ought to exercise in virtue of his duties to humankind. For a person who already displays such cruelty to animals is also no less hardened towards human beings. So instead of there being a direct duty, Kant argues that we have an indirect duty to be kind and avoid cruelty to the non-human around us because of what it does for us and thereby what it will do to us when we do engage with other human beings. It's sometimes frustrating that different ethical frameworks will lead to different ethical conclusions. But in this case, it's interesting because in this example, all three of the frameworks converge. Quite simply, if we treat robots in inhumane ways, this would be the virtue ethics approach, we risk becoming inhumane ourselves. So we could argue from a deontological perspective, as Kant does, that we have at least an indirect duty to avoid cruelty to non-humane, non-conscious, etc. There is the utilitarian reason that I quoted from a Harvard Business Journal. We should avoid cruel behavior, in this case towards animals, because it will lead to cruel behavior towards humans and or profit loss. And then virtue ethics directly. It is bad to abuse robots since it is not virtuous to do so. And I know that many of you are sort of cringing when you hear this word virtue, but please try to hold that in check, and we'll come back to that in a bit. The abuse of robots is not bad because of the robot, but because it is vicious, not virtuous for us as human beings. So again, virtue ethics is a term that I'm increasingly uncomfortable with, and partly because it makes usually people in the audience quite uncomfortable. In this part of the world where we have there are still people who go to church, surprisingly perhaps, but then they have things called confirmations. And so they have a confirmation leader, konfileder in Norwegian. And my students sometimes have told me that when I talk about virtue ethics, I sound like a konfileder. So if you're having that sort of discomfort with this, you might want to think of this instead of virtue ethics as something like capability ethics. The term that we're translating comes from the Greek arete, which is better translated as excellence or capacity or ability. These are things that we need in order to function well as a human being. And I'll mention quickly that virtue ethics seems to be a global ethics. And in my mind, this is because most of us wake up in the morning, wherever we are, really preferring to be happy rather than not, wanting to be content in the Greek eudaimonia, where content or contentment is not simply a kind of immediate present, immediate joy or happiness, but a long-term sense of satisfaction or fulfillment. I often use the example of a musician who works and practices and thereby learns how to acquire skills and present skills that are satisfying in their own right. Since Miguel is in the audience, I will also use the example of gamers. Gamers also know about virtue in this sense, in terms of learning skills that make them better as gamers. And that involves not just an immediate kick from winning a game, but a more long-term sense of eudaimonia, at least I think so. So what sorts of habits should we cultivate that will lead to increased capacity for judgment, greater sense of harmony with myself and others? And in some of these frameworks, and in an era of climate catastrophe, it's not unreasonable to ask the question, what do we need to do in order to live in harmony with a larger natural or perhaps supernatural order. So I always go to Shannon Valor, who is, in my experience of these things, a central figure here, who points out that we need the virtues of patience, perseverance, empathy, trust, and so forth, as these are necessary for deep friendships, long-term commitments to a partner, parenting, and so on. And so for those of you who've heard this bit of the talk before, I'm sorry to bore you with a repetition, but it helps illustrate the point that if you are still paying attention after 24 minutes, it's because you have these virtues of patience, perseverance, perhaps empathy. And when you were 4 years old, you were probably not so good at these. None of us are. These have to be learned, they have to be acquired, they have to be practiced. Again, not necessarily because somebody comes in with a rule book and says, do this, but we know through our experience that these kinds of capacities do help us enjoy a greater sense of contentment, good lives of flourishing, and that sort of thing. What's interesting to me about virtue ethics, which has enjoyed a renaissance, especially in the last 20 years, is, first of all, that you find it just about everywhere. You find it in Confucian thought, Buddhism, Abrahamic religions, Aristotle, Renaissance Enlightenment, the Aufklärung, Oplysning, and so on. Kant, in particular, conjoins deontology with virtue ethics. And I'm not quite sure why, but interestingly enough, Norbert Wiener, who wrote the first textbook on what we now call computer ethics, the human use of human beings, settled on virtue ethics as the core of his approach to information and computing ethics. Wiener highlighted liberty and the motto of the French Revolution, liberté, égalité, fraternité, meaning the liberty of each human being to develop in his or her freedom the full measure of human possibilities embodied in him or her. Our unfolding of our freedom in this way is central to the good life as conceived of in virtue ethics as a life of flourishing. And okay, that's nice. That's 70 years ago. But what's really remarkable is how this has become incorporated, not simply in information and computing ethics in the last 20 years, but most recently in this massive project by the International Electronic and Electrical Engineering Association, the IEEE, to develop ethics by design within AI. And when they have, it's a 3-year project, it's still going on, but the publication of their first document on this put virtue ethics, whether Western or others, at the center. They cite Aristotle here. This is on page 2 of the executive summary. Perhaps because more utilitarian ethics have been dominant in particularly engineering approaches to the world. They make the point, our goal should be eudaimonia, a practice elucidated by Aristotle that defines human well-being, both at the individual and collective level, as the highest virtue for a society. And so the language is familiar, translated roughly as flourishing. The benefits of eudaimonia begin with conscious contemplation, where ethical considerations help us define how we wish to live. And whatever our ethical practices across the globe, honoring holistic definitions of societal prosperity is essential versus pursuing one-dimensional goals of increased productivity or gross domestic product. Finally, there's this nice conjunction of both deontology and virtue ethics in their last sentence. Autonomous and intelligent systems should prioritize and have as their goal the explicit honoring of our inalienable fundamental rights and dignity, as well as the increase of human flourishing and environmental sustainability. So for me, what's remarkable about this is that they certainly engaged in conversation globally with philosophers, scholars of religion, and others. But this is an ethics that comes out of the engineering community. Partly, I know, because of their own experiences with how not taking into account something beyond a utilitarian approach could often lead to great harms, both to individuals and to larger groups. So if we move then to human-machine research and ethics, let's start with something of a definition of human-machine communication. This overlaps a little bit with human-robotic interaction, but I wanted to have a definition here, and this is from the work of Andrea Gutzman, as I'll give you a citation in a bit. So what is human-machine communication? At first level, when we first think about it, we might think of this as technology, communication with technology. But even so, technology is more than simply a channel or medium. It now becomes a communicator. So whether it's the robot dog who at least communicates tacitly or through body language, or your virtual assistant, and so on, it is now communicating with us. Level 2, communication is conceptualized as more than the study of roles in a process and the transmission of information. So the old sort of Shannon Weaver understanding of communication as information transfer. What is now central is a focus on the meaning of messages and their effects, to start with, and how meaning enters into people's relationships with one another. But what this also entails, communication is about the means through which people learn about their world. They form an understanding of self and other, and contribute thereby to the shape of society. This means then a very broad agenda or brief for communication research. Who are we? Who are we with one another? And what is the reality that we are creating through communication? Human-machine communication thereby switches from that of a process between a person and a technology to the creation of meaning between human and machine. So 10 years ago, much of this was more in the domain of theory and a few sophisticated labs. This is now becoming much more commonplace and spreading rapidly, particularly with virtual assistants, robots, and so forth. So some sample questions from human-machine communication. How do messages from robots affect us? And I'll give you an example of that in a bit. What sort of relationships emerge when a technology becomes a communicator? How do people understand themselves as the results of their interactions with a virtual agent? What type of society is being constructed through people's ongoing communications with both humans and machines? What is communication now as it extends to our interactions with machines? So this is the first sort of anthology on human-machine communication, edited by Andrea Gutzman, 2018. Within that book, you'll find examples how the social identity of robots is constructed through their marketing design and consumer interpretations, robots in educational contexts, communication with healthcare robots, which is a rapidly growing field, people's conceptualizations of selection algorithms. I don't know if you have ever cursed Spotify or Netflix. That would be a variation on cursing Siri, perhaps. I've done work on the ethics of sex bots and the virtues of being human. And more recently, this very interesting experiment in which we use the robot Telenoid as a proxy job interviewer with the view of robots would seem to perhaps overcome obvious human biases in a job interview. Would the job interview thereby seem more fair? And is that a good thing? That paper is in revision and will be published soon and will make for interesting reading. If you're interested in it, I'll send you the reference. Please contact me by email. I became very interested in this partly as I became more aware of work with people in the autism spectrum. So some of you may know the robot Casper, which was developed. Casper does not have emotions, but Casper can express emotions. And the idea is to try to help train or evoke the virtues, if you will, of happiness and empathy in autistic children. So this is Casper at work, trying to teach children, by the way, if you hit me, it hurts, and that's not pleasant. And insofar as this works, one of the things that is striking is how effective such robots can be in teaching notions of shared presence, co-presence, as well as empathy. And I want to emphasize, and this is from Ekaterina's work, empathy is not natural in some ways. It is to some degree a learned skill or virtue. So if we go back then to AIs or robots or the conjunction in a social robot, even if the device itself cannot experience pain, so from a utilitarian perspective, as Noel said, no problem, kick it all you like. Even if it has no human-like consciousness or autonomy or intentionality, no problem, at least from a question of direct duties and deontology. But what about asking a research subject to kick a social robot? From a virtue ethics perspective, this is problematic because, as some of the research I will show you here demonstrates, perhaps counterintuitively, this seems to go contrary to our sense of what is a good thing to do, and thereby risks harming the character of or virtues or capacities of the research subject. You can sometimes boil research ethics down to do no harm. And generally, we want to be very careful about asking research subjects either to do harm to others or to inadvertently or not do harm to themselves. I want to emphasize the sort of, or raise the stakes in a way by talking about, as we head into the close, what happens if we ask people to go against their better judgment. So there's some fairly famous examples here. There's the Zimbardo Stanford prison experiment, which some of you may remember or know about, in which students were told to play the roles of guards or prisoners. They had to stop the experiment after 24 hours because the guards were being very unkind to the prisoners. There's the Stanley Milgram shock experiment, where volunteers were asked to impose what they were told was an electric shock of increasing lethality on an innocent human being. These experiments have now been called into question as being rigged in a certain way, but they claim to show that human beings are actually quite willing to inflict pain if under orders from an authority figure. What happens, though, if the victims are virtual? Surprisingly, perhaps, this is not easy for human beings either. There have been at least a few studies that have tried to replicate the Milgram experiments using avatars, and people regard find this a very difficult thing to do. One summary is that according to Milgram, when people are told to do such things, they enter an agentic state. The presence of the authority figure somehow manages to get them to attend to the authority figure only, and they become insensitive to the plight of their victims. But even in these cases with avatars, people resisted the idea of inflicting harm, and the so-called high identifiers, the ones who wanted to be helpful, who wanted to do something for the science to be gained in the study, did everything they could to avoid shocking the avatar. They would help it, they would give it clues, and they were more hesitant to press the shock button. So according to at least some, this refutes the agentic claim. So if kicking a robotic dog is somehow more dramatic, then this still seems to show that asking people to commit even low-level violence against a virtual subject is problematic. Some of this might go into care ethics that we haven't talked about, where there's a sense of care for those within close proximity, at least. Virtue ethics, again, is it ethical to ask research subjects to undertake acts that go against their better judgment? Again, if we are concerned about how people develop judgment, phronesis, as both a practical wisdom and a capacity to make good ethical judgments as central to lives of contentment, good lives of flourishing, and so forth, what do you think? Should you kick a robot dog? Should you torture an avatar? And now here's the quiz. You are the Swedish Ethical Review Authority. I want to say you are the Spanish Inquisition. I hope there's a Monty Python fan out there. How would you respond if you had a research ethics proposal in front of you that said the research subjects would be kicking robot dogs, that the research subjects would be torturing an avatar? And I just want to start with, or leave you with those questions and an image of how I feel doing research ethics with robots, but also, if nothing else, a bit of a cartoon. Maybe there are occasions in which it would be okay to curse Alexa if you enjoy the cartoon. In all events, many thanks for your humane attention, patience, perseverance, and empathy.
Thank you. We'll see if we have any questions, but in the meantime, I'll pose the first one, which is a very general question in relation to these topics that I've been thinking about. And I mean, it's, if you let me draw a parallel first, in analyzing the role of, say, algorithms in society.
Yeah.
Because that also relates to the rise of artificial intelligence and so on. There's this issue, a discussion that arises easily between, say, social scientists and humanities scholars with at least a self-proclaimed more critical perspective than some of the people, maybe that's a stereotype, but who work in developing and engineering the algorithms. So if we take this example that I've been returning to in different situations, there was, just to take a very concrete example, this face recognition algorithm that was implemented in the passport controls in the UK that had problems detecting people that had a dark skin color. They couldn't pass and they got into troubles in the passport control because of that. Then, of course, we can say this is a racist algorithm. And then if we fix the algorithm, then we fix the algorithm, but as a sociologist, I would say we don't fix racism by fixing the algorithm. So I was thinking then if we switch this over to your area, like with robots and ethics and so on, I would say that, for example, if we take the very classic example of robots in factories, for example, robots do the work instead. That's more ethical than having workers, physical bodies, biological entities that we sort of exploit in the factories. That's one example out of two. The other one is, since you've been doing work in the area of sex bots, for example, we have the situation, let's say, scenario, perhaps a bit controversial, but say a sexual relation is based on mutual respect and that type of thing. A person interacting with a sex bot, that removes potentially the need to be respectful to your partner and so on. So the issue generally, the case of a robot working in a factory or the case of a robot entering a sexual relationship with a human, does this solve these problems, do you think, of exploitation or gendered violence or whatever? Or what are the dilemmas here? I mean, it's not a yes or no question.
Right. No, it's a long list of dilemmas. I'll start with the robots first, because just to say quickly, I hope quickly, you're exactly right. I think that a central problem with sex bots, particularly the way they end up being designed, guess what? Female, young, submissive. Why are we surprised? This by design cuts out the possibility of an other who has his or her own autonomy, who has his or her own choice, his or her own desire, and so on. So I have made an argument based on the work of Sarah Ruddick that sex bots might be capable of something called good sex. which could be useful and good under certain circumstances, but not something called complete sex, which is defined precisely by that sense of reciprocity, respect, and so on. So I think there's an answer there, or there's some responses there, but a bit of a wrinkle in there is a question of, can you rape a sex bot?
Yeah, that's sort of what I was sort of beating around that question. That was the core of the question. Yeah.
And that's become its own sort of cottage industry of literature. There's a fellow named Darling who's done, I think, some very thoughtful work. And one idea would be to design the robot so that he or she, they could say no. But he argues against that because he says that only increases the violence of the rape if the owner of the robot actually does that. So I think trying to figure that out is really complicated, and we have work to do. The question of exploitation. I mean, on the one hand, or to go back to your first example, if one is optimistic, then it might be that we will learn. I do think. I mean, I think the example of Tay is kicking us in that direction, and bias in facial recognition and other kinds of algorithms. This is now an enormously recognized problem. So I think in the long run, I'm cautiously optimistic that we can at least minimize the problems of bias and so forth. I don't know that we'll ever get away from them. But I then think the sort of very central question is the one you get to at the last with the robots in the factories. And that is, from a Marxian perspective or from an Enlightenment perspective, we want to have machines that relieve us of tedious labor so that we can do other things that are more interesting, like talking about these things, or doing philosophy, or writing literature, or going to the theater, that sort of thing. So if that vision is there, then that might head us in positive directions. But I think the clear problem is, and it's in Shoshana Zuboff's Surveillance Capitalism. You don't have to be a Marxist, but it helps. I mean, capitalism is a war on labor, because labor costs are the central cost in most systems. So what do we do when all labor is replaceable by robots? What do the rest of us do? And I haven't seen a lot of good scenarios for that. I'm sorry to end with a pessimistic note.
No, but it's these dilemmas are really, I mean, it's like your brain explodes when you think about some of these things. Yeah.